Everyone, it's 5 o'clock here in Finland, and I'm happy to have you all here. My name is Minna-Leena Ojala, and I'm a doctoral researcher and at times a project officer at the University of Turku, Finland. This webinar is part of the activities of the Popcorn Clustering Project, and Popcorn is about preventing oil and plastic contamination of oceans, and we do this by disseminating the results of all previous projects that have focused either on marine plastic pollution or oil spills. In addition to this webinar series, we collect relevant publications to a toolkit that will be published and available on our website. And soon we will also launch a podcast series on these important marine topics. Then we will have a publication in which we will collect everything that we have done so far. So please follow our Twitter account and visit our website every now and then, so you will receive the access to these outputs of Popcorn. Okay, so this webinar series has focused on oil spills, and in the previous webinar, we learned about the role and potential NGOs and volunteers have in coastal oil spill response. Today, we will have a closer look at the importance of oil to wildlife response and the tasks and best practices it requires. Again, we have the honor of having great speakers and experts with us today, and they will share their knowledge, practices, and experience on these topics. As an audience, you may ask questions from each presenter through the chat box. And we have approximately 5 minutes for questions at the end of each presentation. Some of our speakers are also able to stay until the end of the event when we have an additional slot for more questions and discussion. So let's begin. Our first presenter is Vanessa Ryan. She's an experienced marine conservation officer at WWF Finland. Her presentation will give us an introduction into the theme as she focuses on the risks and harm oil causes to the wildlife. Please, Vanessa, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Minna-Leena. I will share my screen and hope that this works. I hope that looks all right. If not, please do let me know. So welcome from my side as well to this Popcorn webinar. Very happy to be here. As Minna-Leena said, my name is Vanessa Ryan. I work as a Marine Conservation Officer at WWF Finland, where I work on marine policy and also oil spill response and oil wildlife response. And I will talk today, give you an overview and an introduction to the risks and harm that oil causes to wildlife. In this presentation, I'm going to go through a few different topics and give you an overview. So first of all, talking about the risk of oil spills, then briefly introducing the effects that oil spills have on wildlife, then potential impacts on species and populations. And then I'll dive into a little bit of environmental sensitivity issues. I believe that Neil is going to talk about this more in detail later on, so I won't go much into detail on that. I'll talk a little bit about vulnerable species and the kind of data needs that we have to be able to make informed decisions and strategy for best response methods. And then a little bit about how countries and organizations can prepare for oil wildlife incidents. And I'll finish off by going through the importance of planning and preparedness and also international cooperation, which I believe will also be presented later on today. So first of all, the risk of an oil spill is ever present, really, in areas of high marine traffic. Maritime safety has improved, and now I'm talking, of course, mainly from a Baltic perspective because I'm myself located on the shores of the Baltic Sea, and we've seen an increase in maritime safety. But accidents have not been completely eliminated, and this is, of course, an issue that we will continue to live with, especially, you know, the human factor is always present, weather factors, faults in machinery, etc. So we can improve maritime safety, but it's very hard to completely eliminate the risk of accidents. Also, a problem is, of course, that very few countries have experience of managing large-scale incidents. So when that unlikely event happens, it will very quickly turn into a big disaster. There's also, of course, big differences, again, speaking from a Baltic perspective in preparedness and the capacity to respond, and also the resources available for a response. These images taken here in this slide are from the Rotterdam port incident, which happened in 2018, and which we will also talk about later on in this webinar. So the risk is there. Now I'm again taking a Finnish and Baltic perspective to marine traffic in general. Here you can see on the left-hand side, unfortunately in Finnish, but I will explain it, the increase in oil transportation since 1995. You can see on the right-hand side of that picture, the big oil ports in the Gulf of Finland, Vysotsk, Primorsk, St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga, Tallinn, Porvoo, and then other smaller ports combined. And you can see that the volume has risen sharply since 95, and now it's stabilized on around 160 million tons per year. And that is where we expect it to continue. Of course, you never know the developments in oil transportations now in the future, but the volume currently is very high. And of course, the Gulf of Finland is also a very heavily trafficked area for example, other cargo ships and also passenger ferries. So the transport is very active. Then on the right-hand side, you see an image of shipping accidents in the Baltic Sea from the year 2020. This is HELCOM data, and you can see that marine incidents do happen. We're up at around 250 per year. At the moment, only 2 of them have luckily in the year 2020 resulted in pollution. And that's, of course, a good development, but the risk is there. Okay, so what are the risks of a spill in general? There have been attempts at quantifying the risk and identifying those kind of really high-risk areas in the Baltic Sea. Of course, shipping is the main cause for the risk in the Baltic area. So just the high volume, and also routes that are kind of crossing each other. So one risk point is the point between Tallinn and Helsinki, where the passenger ferries travel from north to south, and then cargo and oil transport going from east to west and back. So there have been these kind of risk analyses made on a Baltic scale. This is taken from the BRISC project, which was conducted a few years ago already, so it's kind of out of date already. And HELCOM is discussing the possibility of making a new risk assessment for the Baltic Sea as well. But then again, even though we identify the biggest risk areas, and you can see them here on the map, unlikely incidents can still happen in unlikely places. So we have to kind of be prepared for whatever comes our way. In the Gulf of Finland, the authorities have defined a kind of worst case scenario as around 30,000 tons of oil that would spill out, and have tried to calculate the impact that sort of scale of a spill would have, and it could lead to hundreds of kilometers of oiled shoreline. And of course, in the Gulf of Finland, we also live with the fact that we have very limited time to collect the oil from the sea before it hits the shoreline. Then we can't forget smaller sources as well, like land-based sources and wrecks. The Baltic Sea is full of wrecks that still do have some oil in them. So those can also, from corrosion, start leaking. And then, of course, other regions in the world have also had risk assessments done. So for example, for Arctic waters, there have also been attempts to make similar risk assessments. Now to the effects of oil on wildlife. Seabirds are usually the kind of most visible sign of oil or oil effects on fauna. And these are, of course, mostly the first thing you see are the external effects. So you see here on the left-hand side a figure of the structure of the feathers of seabirds, and you can see that they form a kind of impenetrable, almost like a shield, so that the water doesn't get into the down under the feathers and make the bird wet and cold. And when the oil hits the feathers and contaminates the feathers, that structure will be damaged and water will start leaking into the down and onto the skin of the bird. And this will lead then to hypothermia, loss of mobility, so the animals won't be able to forage and move around as usual. And you can kind of compare this as well, the kind of structure of the feathers to Velcro, the way that Velcro kind of attaches on both sides to each other, can be a similar system to what the kind of hooks and barbules and barbs on the feathers of seabirds. And as you know, if anyone is a diver, if you went diving with a dry suit that has a little hole in it, it's enough that you have that one little hole for water to leak in, and you start getting cold and wet. On top of the external effects, so there's destruction of the waterproofness and the feather structure and skin burns that can happen from oil. There are also internal effects from the oil. So when the bird gets contaminated, it will start preening its feathers to try and clean itself off, and it will ingest oil. That can cause damage to the intestines, lead to dehydration, which is one of the first symptoms that we treat in oil birds. And also it can have effects on specific organs like the liver, the lungs, the kidneys, and also the reproductive organs, which can also then have longer lasting effects. Now, what are the impacts of an oil spill, the potential impacts? One good thing to remember is that there is no kind of straight line correlation between the amount of seabirds affected and the amount of oil that's spilled. So depending on the time of the year, the exact location of the spill, and also the species involved and their behavior, you could see very different results. So you might have a very small spill that causes massive destruction in bird populations, or you might have a very, very big spill that doesn't really cause as much destruction among bird populations as you thought. You can see here from the table at the top of the page some examples. For example, the Exxon Valdez in '89, 37,000 tons of oil was spilled and 350,000 birds were estimated to be affected. But then we have cases like the Brer, where 85,000 tons of oil was spilled, and only, if you can say that, only 6,500 birds were oiled. And then you have a case like the Tricolor in 2003, where you could call it a small amount of oil compared to the other spills here in the table. Was spilled only 170 tons, but the estimated amount of seabirds was up in the 40,000. So it's important to take those local aspects into consideration, and also the local species. Then we have to, of course, remember that it's not only seabirds that are affected. We're very much focusing on seabirds because it's a very visible sign in nature that something has happened, and they're also relatively, it is possible to capture them and treat them. But there are other species groups, of course, that will also be affected. So different sorts of mammals, seals, whales, otters, beavers, and sea turtles, of course, as well. And also fish spawning can be significantly affected also in the long term. So for example, from the Exxon Valdez, we have now research that shows that the effects of oil spills can actually last for a very, very long time. So especially it had a heavy impact on herring and pink salmon populations, which were, like, the spawning was severely affected for a very long time, and also on orca populations that haven't recovered. So let's quickly dive into the environmental sensitivity, and as said, Neil will talk about this more in detail. So we don't, it's not enough for us to know only where the kind of high risk areas for marine incidents, maritime shipping incidents are. We also need to know very much about the environment that is in the area, and how this the impacts of the oil can then be minimized. So we need to know all sorts of things like beach structure and quality, what sort of sensitive species live on the beach or in the surroundings. We ideally also have information about the underwater environmental values, where the important areas like reefs and sandbanks, seagrass meadows, estuaries, places that have to be protected from the impacts of the oil before the oil hits the shoreline. Then we also need to have information on fish spawning areas, where marine mammals are for example, have important haul out sites, etc. And then, of course, the data about the birds. So here you can see also kind of an environmental sensitivity map from the BRISC project on the right-hand side. And then preferably for example, bird species, we gather detailed information about, on a species level, about where we are likely to encounter certain species at a certain time of the year, and estimated numbers as well of how many individuals could be in that area. So vulnerable species are, of course, especially endangered species that are either important on a national level or a regional level or even on a global level. And species that aggregate in certain areas at a certain time of the year. So you might have a very large proportion of that population in one place at a given time. And if an incident happens in that area, then you will see really large impacts on that species in particular. So here in the picture, we have a common eider, which is classified as endangered. And then we have on the right-hand side images for the long-tailed duck, where you can see kind of aggregation areas during the wintering period. And you can see those red areas where very many animals aggregate. So having that data on where and when you can find species and in which numbers is really, really essential for being able to plan ahead. Here are some other maps, courtesy of Nele Marconas from Kiel University. These were based on bird inventories during 2015 and 16. You can see here a sensitivity map of seabirds to ship traffic in the German portion of the Baltic Sea, and of course the red areas there are the ones that are most sensitive. And you can see that quite a large portion of the coastal waters of Germany are very sensitive to oil spills in winter time, at least. And there on the right-hand side, you can also see a map of the preliminary data on common eider, and you can see the massive aggregations there in Danish water. And here is just a more detailed picture of how many animals you can actually encounter on a very, very small strip of sea. So we're really talking about hundreds and thousands of animals. So how can you prepare for an oil spill then? First of all, of course, knowing the sources of likely spills, so the shipping, the harbors, the industry, and locating those and quantifying the risks that those sources pose, and making those kind of worst case scenarios. Secondly, know where your sensitive areas lie. Also, even using local knowledge for determining, what the accessibility is for those areas, what the kind of first response methods could be or should be, what habitats are in the area. And then on a species level, know your bird populations, the species distribution and the expected numbers in different seasons. And also based on this data that is so very important, what we would expect countries to do is develop a multi-annual preparedness, I call it a preparedness framework that consists of different elements. So developing an oiled wildlife response plan, and I will have one slide on that particular aspect coming up next. Then of course, building up relationships and networks, that is so important for us as well as an NGO, working together with the authorities, finding the right experts to work with, so vets and ornithologists that will be needed for a response. develop a training and exercise program that aims at really raising the preparedness level in your country and determining what sort of experts and what sort of training you need, and also identifying the bottlenecks. And exercises can be really, really valuable for the development work and identifying the problems that you have in your wildlife response system. Also, of course, keep an up-to-date stock of emergency equipment and know where to get more. Also identify those sources where you can quickly get the equipment you need. And of course, very importantly as well, ensure that there is funding for all wildlife response development work, because in a lot of countries, there is no annual funding available for example, NGOs or other organizations to keep up the development work and conduct, for example, training and exercises. And then to the old wildlife response plan. So a national wildlife response plan would need to take into account a lot of different aspects of the response. And here I'm just picking out a few. So basing your plan on the likely scenarios that you could encounter, of course, bearing in mind that very unlikely event, but basing it on existing information that you have and also identifying information that you still need to gather, for example, on the distribution of your seabirds. Then going into detailed response concept and strategies. So what are you going to do? Are you going to rehabilitate the birds? Are you going to euthanize the birds? Is it going to be a combination of the two? Do you have developed guidelines and protocols for how you will do this? What sort of methodology will you use? Then also identifying the organizational setup. So who are the responsible authorities? Do they have the mandate to make decisions in a spill? What are their relationships to other authorities that might be involved in an oil spill offshore or shoreline response? And also identify all the stakeholders that would need to be involved. So rehab centers and non-governmental organizations and volunteers that might just show up like convergent volunteers who will take responsibility for them and define their roles. Then you need to, of course, have a system for mobilization and decision-making. So how do you notify all the stakeholders involved in the process and who has the power to make decisions, for example, on scaling up or scaling down or calling international assistance. You'd also need to identify key positions in a response. Who will be a wildlife manager? How will that work? What is the relationship between people in different positions, and who are the organizations or people who will fill those positions? And importantly, of course, you need to identify your facilities, how logistics are going to be carried out, and where you're going to get the equipment you need. And last but not least, sorting out the financial aspects of everything. How do you do your claims? How do you make sure that organizations involved have the funds available that they need? And then coming to, I think, my last slide, just mentioning the importance of international cooperation as well. So very few countries, as I mentioned at the start, have the experience of a large scale oil spill, and very few countries have the resources to deal with a large scale spill on their own. So we would have to start looking into resources that our neighboring countries have. So of course, it's very important to train local responders and to be able to start a response and to have that kind of basic framework set up and functioning, and also have the possibility to deal with smaller scale spills on your own. But it is also very, very important to facilitate cross-border cooperation, just to ensure that you have those adequate resources in large scale spills. And it might surprise people how large an operation like that might actually be. I think that was it. I hope that I stuck to my time, and thank you very much for your attention. And
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Vanessa. That was a really, really good presentation. Maybe this relates to the last slide. I was thinking, how do you see the current situation? How well are the authorities and decision makers aware of the importance of oil to wildlife response, for instance, in Finland, the Baltic Sea region, or worldwide?
Yeah, I think in Finland we're doing quite well. We've been doing it for quite a long time, advocating for old wildlife response, and we're really doing cooperating a lot with the authorities, which is really a great thing. So we're all aware of who will do what, and we are developing and finalizing our oiled wildlife response plan. And I think the Baltic in general has been quite, let's say, not best in class, but we're at least trying via HELCOM as well. And we have a dedicated HELCOM wildlife group that works on these issues. So I think really countries are more and more realizing the importance of integrating oiled wildlife response in their oil spill response planning. Hopefully, we will see the commitment as well with staffing and funding for these.
Yeah. I hope we will see that as well. Now it's time to move to the next presentation, and we are going to revisit the year 2018 when there was an oil spill accident in the Rotterdam port area in Netherlands. Daniela Barreras Piesot, Senior Technical Advisor from Sea Alarm, will tell us more about the incident and especially what happened to the wildlife and how the animals were taken care of.
Hello everybody. Yes, I'm going to present about the Bodybuild incident. So let me share my screen. Okay, and now I just need to put it full mode. Okay, so yeah, this is my presentation. Yes, as Mina said, thank you, Mina, for introducing me. I'm a senior technical advisor in Sea Alarm Foundation, but also acting with my colleague Saskia, which will present a bit later, acting as Europa Secretariat, and hence our presentation has got the Europa background. So this is part of a package from the Europa network, which will be explained a bit later by Saskia. So the Bodybuild incident in the Netherlands, hold on. I'll be explaining a little bit about the incident itself. So what happened, how we dealt with the animals, and how it developed. Then some facts and statistics that just highlight the main wildlife issues from the incident. Some of the success factors, how did we consider that the response was a successful response in that regard, and some messages to take away. So in a nutshell, the MS Bodybill incident happened when the MS Bodybill vessel collided with a pier in the port of Rotterdam on the 23rd of June in 2018 and leaked 217 tons of fuel oil. Though that oil was spilled in the water in the harbor area, but quickly started spreading all around. And by 8 p.m. that day, hundreds of swans were being oiled and being recovered by the public. And I will explain a bit later about that. Quickly after, Sea Alarm contacted the Rijkswaterstaat, so the authorities in the Netherlands, to see what happened. And they just confirmed that the incident had been happening and it was verified. So immediately after, the Dutch national authorities activated what they call the Dutch National Response Plan. And for the moment, that plan involved activating a contractor which started building a rehab center in a temporary wildlife hospital in a specific location. And also started with some relocation of those animals into normal or existing rehab centers while the other one was being built. So that the center was being built between day 2 and 3 and got fully operational by day, not fully operational, they started receiving some swans on day 3, and they started receiving, putting some swans in different pools by day 7. And the incident finished by day 30 when the last one was released from the temporary wildlife hospital. And I will go into more detail in the next slides. So this is the location of the spill. So the spill happened in a concrete place in the harbor of Rotterdam. But as I said, the oil started spreading quite quickly due to the currents, due to the tides. And the oil spread it around along the whole Rotterdam harbor area, but also to the North Sea. And with that spreading, the environment was impacted, but also the swans were impacted, and the swans were getting oiled. And At the same time, the different members of the public started collecting swans, started getting swans from the environment and trying to rescue them. And as you can see in the different pictures, they did it in the way they could, not taking into account one of the most important things when responding to an oil spill, which is health and safety. And as you can see, lots of pictures with responders, volunteers, and members from the public just holding oiled animals in their bare hands. So not considering protection, PPE, and so on. So the different swans that were oiled were getting collected into different permanent facilities that were already existing in the Netherlands. So one in the north of the site location and one to the east of the site location, and they were even brought to an improvised garage. But it was that was just a temporary solution while the temporary wildlife hospital was being built. But as soon as that one was ready to take animals, all those animals were transported to that hospital so that they could be managed in a common way in the same place with the same resources. So this was the location where the temporary wildlife hospital was built. The incident happened on a Saturday, and on the Sunday, the subcontractor that was identified in the Dutch plan was already on site with some Europa experts just to see if the place was fitted to accommodate that temporary wildlife hospital. And it was on the Monday, so the following day, that the subcontractor started already building that facility. So the facility was divided in two different places next to each other, obviously, but the main base of the main hospital was located in a parking area next to this barrier, surgeon barrier, where there was a visitor center. So the main base was constructed there. But also there was a satellite location identified where the rehabilitation procedure identified the place to put their pools where the different swans were getting transported after being washed and so on. And I'll explain later a bit more about that. So this is what the main base of the temporary wildlife hospital looks like. The Europa experts were key to develop that hospital. Their experience into getting technical inputs on how to build the hospital was key. And as you can see, there are different areas. They've got the reception area, an intake area, the veterinary room, a big area for stabilization with lots of different pens where the swans could be resting before getting washed. So then they went to the washroom, which was located inside as well. And they also needed a kitchen and some facility areas for the volunteers and people working in the hospital. But it's that hospital, that tent could not work without many other things around it. And as you can see in this picture, there are many other facilities supporting constructions and so on that were needed to run that hospital, and I'll explain a bit later what it is. So here you can see some pictures of this temporary wildlife hospital inside. So you can see here on the left the intake process, the pens where the swans were resting, the different structure of pens located into that tent. The vet room, also the washing room, including how people were washing and the different stations that they built up for washing the different swans, and kitchen area and so on. So lots of things needed to be developed in that main tent. But it wasn't just that main tent, as I said, that was needed, but also a lot of additional supporting logistics around it. And we can see in the first picture the water treatment that needed to be set up, including warm water that was needed for the washing, power packs to provide electricity to the tent, and many other areas, wastewater tanks, waste collection points, the security, and the Red Cross supporting the whole area. Obviously, toilets, showers, and changing rooms for people working in the area, luckily enough, there was that visitor center, and there was some sort of small area where volunteers and workers could rest and have some lunches and so on. The kitchen, and also on top of all those things on the site, they also needed to be organized, the accommodation for the people working the subsistence, transport, the parking areas, the communications in the area, and many other things like training facilities, etc. So this is an image of this satellite location where the pools were built. It was next to the water, so it was accommodated in the watery area, but they also needed to have some dry places for the swans to be able to rest and get out of the water. The swans were separated in different areas, different pools, depending on their condition. And they were resting there until they got their final checks, and those final checks consisted on the waterproof check, so that they could see, according to the feathers, if they were able to go back to the normal environment and be able to stay waterproof. They were also getting some biometry and some scientific ringing, so that they could follow those animals after the release process. And obviously they were doing also some veterinary checks, like blood sampling and checking the levels of those blood levels on different parameters. So it was after those final checks, if the animals were ready to go, that they were released. And this is a couple of images of when they were, some of the batches of animals that were released, when they were released. And as you can see on the second image, one of the main things of that release event is that the media attraction that those events are taking. So that was in a nutshell what happened there, but we also wanted to present you some facts and statistics. So in total, 522 swans were taken into the rehab center in the hospital, counting for 10,401 swan days, because they were the facility was running for 31 days. And from those 522 swans, 509 were released, which is 97.5% of the intake, which is quite good. And from those, there has been some monitoring processes where they were providing data that 100% of those individuals released were surviving. So that was a really good sign. So this graphic might seem a bit complex, but in a nutshell is showing with the black line on top how animals were getting into the rehab center, into the hospital, and then getting released. So the orange bars were the 7 first days where the animals were getting into the intake area, and the brown bars at the end are showing how those were being released at the end of the rehabilitation process. And the other yellow line shows how these animals were getting ready to wash, and they were being washed. So that line goes down while they are getting into the conditioning pools, which is the green line increasing. So in a nutshell is how that flow of animals was going throughout the temporary wildlife hospital. If we look at the resources, it has to be highlighted that 1,387 man days were used in total. On average, as you can see on the graphic, around 50, 60 people, even 70, close to 70 people were used in an average each day. And from those people used, as you can see in the different colors from the bars, you can see national responders, you can see international experts, but also volunteers. And this is quite important to highlight, that our response cannot be run just only by local people. Well, you can run it by local people if they are fully trained, but you quite likely need support of additional experts, and national and international experts are always welcome to support this kind of responses. So if we look at the cost of the response, and this is some numbers that most of the times stroke most of the people looking at it. The wildlife response cost in total was around between 1 and 1.5 million. But if we look at how much that is relatively to the cost of the total response, which was 80 million, that is just 1.8% of the total response. So one could say that it is expensive to rehabilitate those animals, but it's not as expensive as the total response you might have, and the total money, the total cost you might need to pay for a proper response of a normal spill response. And finally, we just wanted to highlight as well some of the success factors of that response. So apologies, this is coming in steps. Oops, let me go back. So one of the success factors could be highlighted at national level. It was really, really good that the Netherlands had that wildlife response plan in place, but not only that plan, but also the engagement of the authorities for that plan and the response from day one of the incident. So that link to the authorities and the acknowledgement of the responsibility was really, really important. And not only that, but also having those all different organizations in the network, the Sun Response Expertise Network that was trained already in the Netherlands as part of this preparedness program that was running from 2009 to 2022. That was also key to have those local people supporting the incident. And one of the key figures in that response was the constructor that was on retainer. So the wildlife response plan identified a retainer, a constructor that can build that temporary wildlife hospital if needed, with a time frame of 24-48 hours. So having all that in place made it possible to develop what you saw on the pictures and develop the response that was that took place during the incident. But it's not only a national level, but also regional level. So as we were saying, Europa experts were moved from different places in Europe to support the response as well. So the Europa network, together with the way of working, the protocols and the standard way of acting and responding, were mobilized into the Netherlands quite quickly. And since the people trained in the Netherlands were trained in the same way, the same manners, following the same protocols as the Europa standards, that integration of responders, both at national and regional level, was really, really successful, because they were all talking the same language. And then not only regional, we can go even further. So at global level, we've got the Ngos network and some, which just includes some international organizations. So a couple of organizations from the States and from Brazil sent some responders as well to support the response. And again, these organizations are also following what we call these good practice guides published by IPICA and for industry. But those good practice guides are in line, and they are following as well the same principles as are followed in the Europa manual. So altogether, getting integrated was one of the key factors of success of the response. So a few messages to take away. So a temporary wildlife hospital is not a plug and play. So you need to pre-invest. So you need to prepare yourself. You need to have a plan. You need to have some authorities backing up the response, backing up that plan, and making sure that things happen according to plan. So having that contractor 24/7 as a resource is key, but it needs to be in place. It needs to be contracted, it needs to be tested, it needs to be ready to go as well. And as we were saying, one of the strengths of the response was that integration between local Europa and international partners, international responders. And that has been also possible thanks to some EU projects and other industry project investments that have made available that possibility of responding as networks and as organizations in a coordinated manner. So this was me. I just wanted to share a quick video. Let me check the timings. We are, it's 3 minutes. Shall I run it, Mina, or shall I just send the link on the...
Maybe Neil James.
It's fine by me. Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me do this, new share, advanced video. I think it's a good video because it really shows what I just explained. Here we go, open. Can you see the image of the swan?
Yes.
Okay, good.
In de Rotterdamse derde petroleumhaven is een schip lek geslagen. En ongeveer 200 ton stookolie is in het water terechtgekomen.
De eerste tijd is reuze spannend. Je moet zo zien, op zaterdag krijg ik een appje binnen van de beheerder van vogelklas Karel Schot. En zij zegt, tja, er is een oliemorsing in de haven van Rotterdam. Kijk op het nieuws.
En ongeveer 200 ton stookolie is in het water terechtgekomen.
Je kunt alleen maar snel operationeel zijn als je een plan hebt. Sonrespons en de vogelopvangcentra zijn onderdeel van dat plan. Sea werkt met Rijkswaterstaat, dat is een NGO in Brussel, die gewend is overheden en industrie te adviseren hierover. Intussen wordt het hele opvangcentrum in gereedheid gebracht. Er worden hokken neergezet, voer wordt gecheckt. Zwanen worden hier naartoe gebracht met de dierenambulances en worden dan ingeschreven en krijgen een tijdelijke ring. Zwanen die meteen medische zorg nodig hebben, die gaan door naar de dierenarts. Ze krijgen de eerste 48 uur vocht toegediend om te stabiliseren. Daarna krijgen ze zondevoeding en dat gebeurt allemaal volgens schema. De werkwijze die we hier hanteren is het Europees protocol. Ik zie hier ook heel veel bekende gezichten. Onze internationale collega's uit Engeland, Duitsland, België en Estonia, die het protocol heel goed kennen en veel ervaring hebben met oliespeels en vogels. Als blijkt dat ze sterk genoeg zijn na die stabilisatieperiode, dan kunnen ze gewassen worden en gespoeld. Dat spoelen is zo belangrijk om alle zeepresten uit hun verenpak te spoelen. Vervolgens gaan ze naar de zwembaden. En die zwembaden zijn nodig voor de zwanen om zich te kunnen poetsen. Ze gaan in het water, ze gaan uit het water. En ze leggen hun veren precies op de goede plaats. Op dit moment zijn er ongeveer 500 zwanen in het centrum aanwezig. En zijn we op zwaannummer 200 met bassen. Het is zo bijzonder dat al deze mensen die hier zijn allemaal meewerken in shifts om die zwanen weer te revalideren. Het grootste gedeelte zwanen komt hier supergoed uit en krijgt gewoon een tweede kans. Ik ben altijd zo onder de indruk dat de missie van Rijkswaterstaat is dierenleed beperken. Want Rijkswaterstaat, dat zijn stoere mannen met heavy equipment. En iedere keer zeggen ze het doel is om dierenleed te beperken. En dat raakt me altijd zo.
Okay, that was it. I think it's a really nice video to see and to have a better idea of what happened there. So that's me. That was my last slide. So if you have got any questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. The questions can be now asked in the chat box as we move forward. And next, Neil James from Environmental Research Institute, UHI, North Highland. He's a marine ecology and environmental conservation expert, and he will tell us about the oil vulnerability index and maps that benefit especially the planning of oil to wildlife response.
Hi, thanks, Mina-Lena. It's an honor to follow those two talks. Really interesting, really great talks. Yeah, absolutely fascinating to see what's on kind of the front line of oil spill response. Helping out the swans there, and Vanessa's talk was fantastic in giving the overview and highlighting the importance of the whole environment as well. So that's really thrilled to see those. So my work with my colleagues I'll be presenting today I'm kind of combining two kind of topics into one. So going to be talking a little bit about the oil vulnerability index for birds, and talking about the mapping of this as well, and putting that into the smart map, which is part of the App for Sea project. So my name is Neil James, and have been working on pollution issues for a while now, plastics and oil as well. And I've worked on quite a few projects, including App for Sea, which was looking at oil spill response preparedness. And I'm also part of the Popcorn project, which is currently running and is hosting this webinar series as well. So seabirds are one of the most threatened groups of bird species, with pollution being a key threat, but it isn't the only threat. So even though some areas may have some pollution, it's important to remember that these birds are suffering from other pressures as well. So even where pollution may be quite low or minimal, that can have quite a big impact when they're already suffering from other threats as well. Seabirds are particularly vulnerable to oil pollution, which can cause mass mortality events, as we've heard previously. But it's also important to note that even minor oil spills can cause problems. And Vanessa's talk gave great numbers there, showing that if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, it can be disastrous for birds. So the area that we're focused on is the Northeast Atlantic area, and this is because it was funded by the Northern Periphery and Arctic program. And the Northern Periphery and Arctic region is one that's increasingly susceptible to negative ecological impacts. And this is because there's increased shipping activity as the Northeastern Passage opens up, and rapid hydrocarbon expansion as well. So lots of kind of drilling for oil and gas. So what we wanted to know is kind of what would the ecological impact of this be on local wildlife, and especially seabirds, because that's been our expertise in our institute. So how does oil affect seabirds? Vanessa went over this already, but it's important to, I don't see any harm in kind of reiterating it. Oil spills at sea, whether they're a result of accident or negligence, they can cause mass mortalities of seabirds. So birds can die. And following an oil spill, seabirds which come into contact with crude oil floating on the sea surface, they can suffer from a whole range of different problems. And we've seen these examples previously where you can get hundreds of thousands potentially of birds dying. And it's important that the dead birds, they're used as dead or dying birds are used as an OSPAR ecological quality objective to monitor oil pollution levels in the North Sea. So this kind of set level, so they say that the average proportion of oiled common guillemots, for example, should be 10% or less of the total found dead or dying in each of the 15 areas of the North Sea over a period of at least 5 years. So it's kind of trying to keep ecological quality objective is about making sure that oil pollution is not causing a higher proportion of death in the common guillemots. And it should be noted the sampling for that should occur in the winter months from November to April of each year. So in terms of the effects that they can have, again, this has already been touched upon, but they can suffocate in oil. Seabirds which are covered in oil can quickly die from suffocation. That could cause a kind of quite quick, instant problem. Oil can cause the feathers to mass and separate, reducing their waterproof and thermal qualities. That can cause hypothermia or even hypothermia in some places. Seabirds will instinctively preen and attempt to get rid of the oil. This means that they can often ingest quite a lot of oil and can damage their internal organs. If birds are spending a lot of time preening, that means that they have less time to do other things, such as foraging for food, but also evading predators, for example. Birds also lose their buoyancy. It can cause direct mortality of their prey species as well. So if there's an impact on the fish species, for example, a seabird predates, then that will have a knock-on impact on that species itself. And in terms of the long-term breeding success as well, there have been some studies that showed that there can be kind of decade-long impacts after an oil spill. So, for example, the Prestige oil spill found that European shags, the number of chicks that they were raising by breeding pairs were reduced in the 10 years following the disaster. So the annual reproductive success was 45% less in the oiled colonies in comparison to the unoiled ones. Now, what can we do to understand the problem, to monitor it and measure it? Well, several countries do carry out beach bird surveys to monitor oil pollution, to determine which seabirds might be most affected by oil spills and where. Another option is to assess the vulnerability of seabirds to oil pollution by going through the species' individual ecological traits and mapping that with spatial data on their distribution and abundance to try and get a good overview of how they're likely to be impacted by oil spills. So this leads us on to the Oil Vulnerability Index. Sometimes they have different names, but we're trying to stick with Oil Vulnerability Index here for now. So they're kind of nothing new. So go back to the 1970s, when the Oil Vulnerability Index for marine-oriented birds in North America, that was kind of used by King and Sanger. And vulnerability indexes in general, not oil vulnerability indexes, but vulnerability indexes, they've been used in other aspects, so to assess other pressures, for example, on offshore wind farms and fishing intensity, for example. But they have been continued to be developed for oil vulnerability indexes for birds as well. So there's been some different iterations here, which you can see from Tasker and Piankowski and Williams et al. Trying to get a better understanding of what are the factors that we need to know about to be able to assess how vulnerable seabirds are to oil pollution. And the kind of biggest, most recent update to the Oil Vulnerability Index was this one called the SOCI, or the Seabird Oil Sensitivity Index. And this is kind of a real kind of step forward, really, because it uses 8 factors to calculate this index, the SOCI. It's a type of oil vulnerability index, but they call it a SOCI. So these are ones which contribute towards sensitivity of seabirds to oil pollution. So there's different aspects which are included in this. So the proportion of time spent sitting on the water, so this is for each individual species, the percentage of tideline corpses contaminated with oil, habitat flexibility, percentage of biogeographical population in the UK continental shelf. I should have mentioned that this is for the UK, so it's around the UK waters. 5 is a listing of birds in conservation concern, presence on EU Birds Directive annexes, potential annual production and adult survival rate. So a whole host of ecological factors and biological traits there. So they're kind of scored on each proportion, and they're kind of summed using this equation. So the ones in red here, so 1, 2, and 3, these are kind of measurements of how likely the individuals are to be affected by oil due to their behavior. The ones in blue, 4, 5, and 6, they're how vulnerable a population or a species is anyway. And the ones in green, 7 and 8, these are how quickly a population or a species might recover from an oil incident. So that's kind of how they're kind of split up. Now, we have here, yeah, I'm just going to move on to the next one. So here we have a list of the 62 seabird species that are widespread in the Northeast Atlantic region. And instead of giving you, we calculated the OVI values for each of these, but instead of giving you that, I've categorized them by color here. So the darker orange ones are the more vulnerable that these species is to oil pollution. So the ones that are most at risk, for example, are razorbill, puffins, velvet scoter, and yellow-billed loon, or white-billed diver. These score the most highly on those previous factors that I showed, and they spend a lot of time on the sea surface, and are of higher conservation concern as well, and are likely to take longer time to recover from oil spill incidents. Conversely, the ones in the kind of much paler orange, the lighter kind of pale orange, these are the ones which tends to include gulls and terns, and they tend to spend less time on the water, for example. So they're likely to be less affected by oil. Now, this method uses Seabird survey data collected from 1995 to 2015 from a survey area extending beyond the UK continental shelf. Uses boat-based visual aerial and digital video aerial survey techniques. These data were then combined with individual seabird species sensitivity index values and combined each location to give a single measurement of seabird sensitivity to oil pollution in an area. So I'll show that in a few slides' time. So what we're trying to do is understand which areas are essentially the worst places to have an oil spill in terms of their impact on birds. Now, the index is independent of where oil pollution is most likely to occur, so that wasn't considered here. However, it indicates the highest seabird sensitivities if an oil pollution incident were to happen. So, for example, here, proportion of time spent on the sea surface and its conservation status are primary factors, whilst adult survival and habitat flexibility are aggravators here. So kind of to put that in a kind of another kind of graphic. So the purple bit is the UK continental shelf. So this is what is already covered by the current spatial SOCI. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to expand that to the northeastern Atlantic, so the whole area in the kind of light blue. And of course, there's several factors we need to take into account, and it's not as easy just to expand it. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand different ecological factors for these species across the whole region. So in terms of their distribution and their behavior and things like that, and for all 62 bird species. So this is what we wanted to do to expand it to this area. Now, of course, we use a lot of different data for this on all the different populations, different species. But tracking in seabird at sea data, so when, rather than when they're just at their nest, when they're out at sea, for example, in the wintertime, the tracking in seabird at sea data is not good enough to establish hotspots during the non-breeding season or to model non-breeding distributions. So we used a BirdLife non-breeding ranges. So we used where the birds can occur. What we did is we also looked at a sensitivity analysis. So what we looked at was these different 8 factors, which I showed you earlier, which go into the SOCI as it currently is. We wanted to see, are they all important? Are some of them not important? Because if that means we can use other factors instead, then that means we could potentially expand it to a larger area, because some of the factors are just not known for certain species, or we don't have good data for them. And so what we found is, so in the kind of red circle there, these are the factors 1, 2, and 3. So these kind of had when we ran a sensitivity analysis, we found that these were the ones which had the greatest impact on the values that come out. So in other words, they're having a high influence, and so these are the most kind of important factors. Whereas factors 7 and 8, these have a lower influence on the species SOCI score, so we don't need to worry as much about them. So perhaps we can, where values don't exist for these factors, we can perhaps use similar scores from similar species, for example, because they don't affect the overall score too much. We have presented this work in the book chapter, which was developed through App for Sea. So again, these are the 8 factors, the same 8 factors. So what we wanted to look at is to see if some of these could be removed or substituted, which would make the index more broadly applicable, especially when paired with huge amounts of seabird tracking data now available. So instead of using the kind of range, can we use tracking data instead? So extending this approach globally would need a lot more work, as seabirds' distribution at sea is still very poorly known, especially for some species. Particularly in remote areas. There's just things that are just not known. But even though that's the case, even though it is data poor in some areas, the ecological and behavioral traits are still very valuable and can be extremely helpful in determining a species' vulnerability to oil spills. But the big spatial gap in spatial data on seabird distribution is obviously very important still. So this is just a kind of example of kind of what we're trying to look at. So this is an Atlantic puffin. So you can see the kind of native breeding areas here and the kind of light, well, I don't even know how you describe that color, kind of greeny yellowy kind of color. And then the native non-breeding distribution is in the kind of blue area. And this means for the non-breeding season, it means that the distribution is quite more broad. Of course, it doesn't mean that the densities of the birds are equal across the kind of dark blue area, but it means that the species can occur there. So what we want to do is kind of map these kind of distributions and the sum of all the other factors as well that go into determining their sensitivity to oil spills, and look at vessels, so shipping vessels and other types of vessels, looking at and seeing if there can be a spatial oil vulnerability index based across the NPA region or the Northeast Atlantic area. And not just in terms of shipping as well, so whether these kind of more sensitive areas, but also in terms of hydrocarbon extraction sites as well. So what we've done, we've done two things. So one is that we have produced a map, which I'll show here. This is part of the App4C Smart Map. So this shows the summed SOCI scores, so essentially the oil vulnerability index for each individual species, but added together, and for each species. And so this shows which areas are more sensitive than others to for their effect on seabird populations. So this one here is in the summer, so in the breeding season, and this is low resolution. We are working on much higher resolution now, and that should hopefully be published soon. But within the smart map in App4C, we have the kind of low resolution maps, so it can be used for educational purposes, for example, but for scientific and oil spill responses, then our high resolution data would be much more valuable. But in terms of the smart map, this is kind of what appears for the summer, the breeding season, and you can see the areas which are kind of more highly sensitive than others. And this is what we see for the non-breeding season. So it kind of covers from October to February. So the kind of darker red are the areas which are more sensitive to oil spills in terms of their impact on seabirds. Again, this is kind of more broader because you're getting a wider distribution of species in the winter time, for example. It's just kind of a mini summary before I go on to showing the kind of smart map layers that we have. The seabirds are negatively affected by oil. It's important to assess the vulnerability of seabirds to oil pollution, and this can be done through assessing sensitivity to oil on the ecological traits, but also the spatial density and the distribution data as well. So it's combining these two. So this can create these kind of hotspots where seabirds are most at risk, and hopefully this has informational use, but also in terms of the high resolution data which is coming, it may help target cleanup efforts and avoidance of important seabird areas. For example, perhaps it can influence where shipping lanes go, for example, or hydrocarbon extraction sites. So now I'm just going to quickly kind of go through the smart map. So here, the App4C Smart Map features 3 ecological zones, or 3 ecological zone map layers. So this is the first one here, and this is how you access it. So under the ecological zones tab, you can easily add the large marine ecosystem of the Arctic area as defined by PAME in 2013. Our work on OVI is embedded in the smart map, but again, I'd like to emphasize that the seabird layers that are about to show are very broad, but the high resolution data is due to be published very soon. Now, one of the layers shows the overall summed oil vulnerability index for all seabird species present in the breeding season. We've removed the kind of very low risk areas, so you just see the medium, high, very high, and extremely high areas. The seabird layers divide the map into ICES statistical rectangles, and the colors indicate vulnerability of seabirds to oil pollution. So the red is extremely high, and the lower vulnerability is green, for example. And we also have the layer for the non-breeding season. And again, you see it's kind of much wider because the species can occur in these areas. If you click on an individual rectangle, then you get a list of the species which are known to be distributed there as well. So there's more information that's hiding inside. Now, another interesting kind of feature of the App4C Smart Map is that the layers can be combined with others that are in the Smart Map already. So, for instance, you can select the Seabird layer, the Seabird OVI layer, and you can view an oil spill simulation at the same time. For example, here, the kind of Brea in 1993. So you can see, and it kind of links into what Vanessa was showing earlier, which is that, you know, in terms of the area that this oil spill was in, it wasn't as bad as it could have been for seabirds. And you can see there, if it would have been in a kind of more darker, already orange area, then more seabirds would have been affected. But it was, even though it was bad, it could have been worse. We've also made a guide, Seabirds and Oil, the risk of oil spills to marine bird species in Northeast Atlantic. And this describes how birds are affected by oil, OVIs, and how to access the seabird layers in the App4C Smart Map. But for now, that is all from me. Happy to talk here or afterwards. Just get in touch. And yeah, I just urge you to follow the App4C project for the usual social media and websites, and the Popcorn project as well. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil. I was wondering, do you think the index and the maps have been utilized well enough and taken into consideration, for example, in marine spatial planning?
Not yet, no. I think it's too early for that. And I think the resolution that's on the smart map is probably not suitable for planning and things like that. But the high resolution data, which we're just finalizing the paper now, and it's got a lot of contributors who've contributed seabird data from, you know, across the region, from Greenland and Iceland and Norway, and that's got much higher resolutions. That I think that is really kind of what people want. So it's kind of really based on that really high resolution data. So I think that definitely could be of great interest and great use.
Good. Can you say who are your target groups for these tools?
These tools, in terms of the smart map, I think educators, I think master students, people want to know about oil spills, want to understand the basics on seabird ecology and behavioral traits and how that impacts into their level of threat in terms of oil pollution. I think that's the kind of main people we're probably targeting with the App4C Smart Map layers. That sort of kind of resolution. So yeah, I think it's a real kind of neat tool, and it really adds. And when you add in those other layers that are already embedded within App4C as well, I think it's a really neat tool.
Yeah. Are you planning, or do you see that in the future you would expand the geographical area even further?
Yes. So subject to funding, but we've talked about we have high aims. We've basically explored the question of what's stopping us from doing it globally. And the big question there is, or the big answer there at the moment, is that the data, those factors that go into calculating the OVI for each individual species, just some of it's just so incredibly data poor for many of the species. So that's what's limiting us. But what we can do is, and through our sensitivity analysis, is say, okay, which factors are most important, and the ones that aren't important, can we use other factors, or can we use the same factor that we know from a similar bird species? So, if how quickly it's likely to rebound from suffering from oil, how quickly the population is likely to rebound. If we don't have those data, then can we use it from a similar species, one that's closely related? So things like that. Of course, it's a lot of effort and it's a lot of work, but we have high hopes, and hopefully one day we'll get a kind of global OVI.
Good. I'd like to see that in the future. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
And our final presentation is about the European Oiled Wildlife Assistance Network, Europa. It gathers the oiled wildlife response experts in Europe to work together to improve professionalism in marine wildlife emergency response. Sea Alarm is the coordinator of Europa, and next, Saskia Sessions-Paplet, the Wildlife Senior Technical Advisor from Sea Alarm, will tell us more.
Thank you very much, Milena. Let me share my screen. If I can make it work. Does this look good?
It's still it's not yet on the presentation mode.
And now?
Now, yes, perfect.
All right. So yes, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. I'm Saskia. I'm a colleague of Daniela's working in Sea Alarm. I'm the other half of the Europa Secretariat. It's been really interesting to listen to this combination of talks, and I think we've seen there how important it is to be prepared for oiled wildlife incidents, and how many different facets of that preparedness there are. There's the practical side, the facilities, the logistics, there's developing strategies, how do you actually deal with oiled animals, but also Neil was really showing the importance of having good information underneath to provide risk assessments that you can base preparedness on. So this need to be prepared is really on our minds with Europa. That's a key mission for us to drive that forwards in Europe. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what Europa is, what we do, and how it can help. So I'll talk about who we are, how we're set up, and what is our mission in Europe. What do we envisage, and what are the needs we think for a response to go well, and for us to be supported if Europa is mobilised. Talk a bit about the relationship model as well that we have with authorities and NGOs. I'll explain what can Europa do, and what can we provide, the kind of services that we provide, and that includes expertise, training and developing best practice standards. And I'll just finish up with talking about the Europa 2 project that we have running at the moment, about what we're working on in that project. So Europa is a network, and our mission is to support and empower EU authorities, NGOs and polluters in dealing jointly with oiled wildlife using agreed international standards. So we're currently a network of 9 organisations in 9 countries in Europe that you can see on the map there. So Vanessa is part of the Europa network, WWF Finland. We also have WWF in Poland. We have the Estonian Fund for Nature, Preparedness in Germany, Son Response, which is in the Netherlands, who were, you saw them in the video earlier in Daniela's talk. And there's the Wildlife Rescue Centre in Ostend in Belgium, the CVFSE in France, Submon is in Spain, and lastly, the Oiled Wildlife Response Network in Ireland. So those are our current 9 members, and Sea Alarm provides a secretariat, as already explained. And we actually created this network originally in 2015 as an expertise network, but also we have an equipment stockpile which is kept in Belgium. So we're aiming to grow this network, to expand it, and eventually to start looking at having representation around the whole of the EU in all coastal countries. So we operate this network through different groups. So we have a general assembly of all the members, a smaller governance committee, and various technical subcommittees. And you can find more information about what we do on our website, europa.eu. So the way we're set up, we're organised around a charter, the Europa Charter, that's been signed by all the members. And that charter is really a joint mission statement, but it formalises the network and positions us really as a European solution for mutual assistance in oiled wildlife incidents. Mutual assistance, if you're not familiar with the term, that just means countries in Europe, or could be outside Europe, but countries that are dealing with a pollution incident which is big and maybe overwhelms their national resources, they can call on their neighbours for help, and that can also be done via the European Union, which I'll explain as well. So now that we have Europa as a formal network, this charter really puts us in that role to provide, we're a good resource to provide that kind of assistance for old wildlife incidents. And the charter is a joint mission statement explaining what we want to achieve, what we want to do, but it also calls on governments to play their part as well. It's not really realistic for all of the ability to respond to a big old wildlife incident to be left to NGOs, to be left to charitable organisations. There is an important part for governments to play as well. So the Charter calls on governments to play their part to adopt and support Europa nationally, and an important part of that is developing national preparedness for old wildlife response, but also to support it internationally, and that's done via the main regional agreements. So these are the intergovernmental bodies in Europe that work on oil spill preparedness, and they all now have language and some policy frameworks around old wildlife response. Europa or CLM also has a formal relationship with the 3 main regional agreements in Europe, including HELCOM in the Baltic Sea, the Bonn Agreement in the North Sea, and REMPEC, which is the Secretariat of the Barcelona Convention in the Mediterranean Sea. So because they are all recognising wildlife response as an important activity, the Charter really speaks to them as well to try and adopt what we're trying to achieve with Europa at international level. So what do we envisage at European level, and what do we think the needs are for a wildlife response to go well? What we consider a prepared country for an old wildlife incident, and this could be other types of marine emergency that affect wildlife on a large scale. We consider a prepared country really has 4 pillars supporting it. One of those is having a national old wildlife response plan, which defines a strategy for how you respond and procedures and commitment of all the actors that are named in it. So that's the formal thing on paper that actually says what will the country do collectively to respond to an incident. But apart from the plan on paper or in a PDF, it's also important that that's supported by a multi-annual preparedness project. And we saw that a little bit in Vanessa's presentation as well. If a plan is not supported over a multi-annual basis to keep it current, to keep people committed to it, then that plan is going to just become something which is not very useful. So multi-annual continuation of that plan being current is important. And part of that multi-annual program should be training and exercising all the different actors in the wildlife response plan. And then last but not least, it is helpful to have Europa membership in that country. So there are people trained to deal with old wildlife in an emergency situation, and they have an interface with this wider network of European experts that can come in to assist. This is another way of talking about the same process, but looking more at the relationships. So for an old wildlife response to go well, it really needs authorities and NGOs to work very closely together. So they're the 2 blue circles you see on the screen there within a country. So the preparedness project, the multi-year preparedness project, that should involve both authorities and NGOs, and ideally with a lead authority that is coordinating the preparedness program and working with a lead NGO who is able to interface with a network of NGOs and other stakeholders in their country. So that multi-annual preparedness project, part of that is having the plan, and the stars you see on the diagram here are actors. So there should be authority actors from different ministries that are named in the plan. They have functions to play, and also people within NGOs and other organizations like veterinarians, scientists that are also actors in that plan. But having that Europa representation means there is a link there to a wider network of experts that have been trained to the same standards at international level. So because of that interface, it's important that a multi-year program includes Europa. So there is accommodation within a national plan for how Europa can support, and it's well understood on both sides what can be provided and what support is needed, but also that Europa personnel are involved in training and exercises where possible. So what can Europa actually provide? We have three main streams of activity, and that includes a pool of expertise, developing standards and training. So I'll just run through each of those to explain them a bit in more detail and show you what we have and what we can do. So firstly, in terms of expertise, Europa provides through the network that we have, there are people who've seen oil spills in the past and they've dealt with large numbers of oiled wildlife. So we have a pool of experts that can assist other countries, can assist European authorities during an emergency. And now that we are a formal system, that can actually be activated by the EU Civil Protection Mechanism. So that's the hub within the EU for countries to request and offer assistance from each other. So qualified experts within the Europa network can form what we call a tier 3 international response team. So the idea is that that international team would actually go into a country and support and integrate with local responders. So local is what we call tier 1, and also tier 2, which is national or regional experts. So the idea is not to come in with hundreds of people and take over. It's very much to work alongside local responders, to assist them, to coach them, with a team that has been trained to the same standards. And obviously you saw with Daniela's presentation, if the people in the country have also received Europa training, it makes that working together much easier. This slide just shows some of the spills that Europa network members and experts have been involved in over the years. So going back to 1998, you see there are quite a few spills here, and some of the logos, various people that have been involved at different levels. So the international community of wildlife responders, and this has mainly been for seabirds, we and they have learned a lot in this process. This international help has been very valuable and very needed in many of these cases. But in going to these international spills, these organisations were finding themselves working alongside each other and learning that perhaps there was a need to be coordinated better at an international level. So going into a situation which is big, and if there was not anything well set up in the country beforehand, we saw through these spills that there was a need for the international responders to work together so that they could be more joined up as an international team. So that's really why we created Europa in the first place. And you'll see we did that in 2015 with the Europa 1 project. And we're now expanding on that in Europa 2, which I'll come on to. So it's just to show there is quite a long history of spills, and Vanessa mentioned some of the same incidents there where we've been and we've learned what are the challenges and how to provide that effective international assistance. The second part of our activities is around developing best practice and standards. So we have a series of 9 standards now, which are technical guidelines on different aspects of oiled wildlife response. So they're part A through to H, and there are different types of document there. So we have a standard operating procedure, or SOP, which is in an external version, which is more for authorities to explain what Europa is, what it can do for them, but what they need to do to support us if we're mobilized. And we have an internal procedure, which is more for the network. Then we have Seabird rehabilitation protocols. We have documents about managing rehabilitation facilities and how to design and equip a facility. We have manuals for responders at basic level, and the one in the middle there, part D, that's a list of equipment. So it's an inventory from our database of the equipment stockpile that we have, and all the technical details of it. The latest addition to this set of standards is an oil impact assessment handbook, which is about the scientific side. So it's a training course for scientists to carry out impact assessment, knowing what impact an oil spill has had on a population of seabirds, and doing necropsy examinations to determine cause of death, and finding out which part of the population animal came from. So that's really the scientific side, and that's the latest manual that we've added to our set of standards. So you can find more information on all of these standards on our website, and the link is there. Not all of them are publicly available. Some are only available at the moment to people who are attending a Europa training course, but anyway, you can find out a bit more about them there, and some of them are public. There are also some international guidelines out there, and Daniela alluded to these as well, this interface between European responders and wider expert networks. But Sea Alarm has been involved in both of those networks, and there's also some overlap. Some of the European organizations in Europa are also part of the global network. So that means that the standards that we have are broadly aligned, and we try to keep that process up. So we're using broadly the same standards. Then we come to training. So over the years with our network members, we've developed a portfolio of training for all wildlife responders, really designed to be a set of European standard courses, which have that value of people following the same courses. It's easier for them to work together internationally if something happens. So there are 6 qualification levels at the moment. We have hands-on levels for basic, advanced and specialist oiled wildlife responders, and that includes a track for veterinarians. Then we have section head and managerial training for people who have to manage an oiled wildlife response. And we also have Europa team training, which is more about the internal management and coordination of us as a team. We've also added 2 new courses this year as part of Europa 2, one on the scientific part, the risk and impact assessment, which we did a couple of weeks ago. And we also have a new course for oiled sea turtle responders at basic and advanced level. So all of those courses are now available. They are generally a combination of lectures and then practical training through hands-on skill labs, but also exercises, sometimes tabletop, sometimes practical exercises, but very much evaluating people's individual skills, particularly as we move into the higher, more managerial levels. Europa training is based on a train-the-trainer system. So as a general rule, if you've reached one qualification level, you're able to train at the previous level, with some exceptions, but that's a general rule. And CLARM keeps a central register in our database of everybody who's completed a Europa training course. So we keep those records. And the way we've set up this training scheme is that it's possible to follow different paths. So somebody who's never seen an oiled bird before can go from that starting point up to become a specialist, for example, or veterinarians can also follow a track from being a specialist vet up to a managing vet, or somebody can go more through the managerial route. But it's important to note that particularly in those higher levels, you cannot become a true manager of a wildlife response by a course of 1 or 2 weeks. It's really a lifelong learning. So gaining those higher qualification levels, there is a program of continual learning through exercises, through real spills, and working in rehabilitation centres to gain those higher levels. These are just some pictures of courses we've run over the last few years. So you can see on the left some of the practical parts in catching oiled birds, and our famous Buddy RoboDuck, who's a small remote controlled duck that helps to simulate the process of catching birds and make it a bit more realistic. And you can see in the second column there, training on washing oiled birds and looking at the pool management aspects, and then some of the veterinary training and the classroom aspects on the right hand side. Just some statistics, we have over the years organised 46 training events, so that tots up as 578 responders trained, which is fantastic. We're pleased about that, in 10 different countries in Europe. So these courses are out there and they're being rolled out, and if anybody is interested in training them, please contact us. Very lastly, the Europa 2 project, wanted to say a few words about that. This is a 2-year project which comes to an end at the end of this year. And it's also co-funded by European Union Civil Protection, as was the first Europa project in 2015 when we created Europa as a formal network. So we have 4 partners. CLARM are coordinating, WWF Finland, Royal Niels in the Netherlands, and Submon in Spain. And basically what we're doing with this project is improving Europe's preparedness for wildlife emergencies by expanding on what we did in the past, and particularly in the first Europa project. So there are 4 main streams, they're technical streams: strengthening network cooperation, creating educational tools for governments and network members, enlarging the training portfolio, and developing a sea turtle branch. So the network cooperation, this is really about maintaining the technical activities within our network. So we had a network meeting a few weeks ago in Belgium, where we had some of our formal governance meetings. We did some technical discussions and technical training, and we also did an inspection of our equipment stockpile. So really all the technical activities that the network is working on to come together to delve into that and to move things forward. The educational tools, mainly for governments, but also useful for network members. This is a series of guidelines and recommendations which raise the profile of wildlife response with authorities and provides them guidelines on how to move forward with it. So we had some workshops online with authorities in February and March where we looked at this issue of integrated management for wildlife response. And that's really about bringing different government ministries together who are stakeholders in a response. But sometimes in Europe we see, or often in Europe, there is a bit of a disconnect between authorities in charge of oil spill cleanup at sea and on the shoreline. So these workshops were really designed to look at that disconnect and try to bring authorities together and explain why that cooperation is important. We're also drafting a desktop study and recommendations on planning for wildlife response, which includes a template for how to develop plans and guidance on that. We have e-learning modules, both for the network members and also authorities. We're also working on guidelines for organising exercises on wildlife response and a tabletop exercise package, which is a way for authorities, NGOs, other stakeholders, excuse me, in a country to come together and take a playful look at what the challenges are in a wildlife response, see what the learnings are there and see maybe where there are areas in a country where preparedness needs some more attention. So that is a series of documents and guidelines we're developing in Europa 2, which we will make available by the end of the project to European governments and also within our network. Training, I already mentioned the 2 courses we're developing in Europa 2, the scientific one, which is very much linked to the type of data that Neil was talking about, this type of vulnerability data. And our training course was looking at what kind of data is out there and how can we make the best use of that data and what is the role of scientists in an emergency response. And we have also developed a new course for wildlife response managers. And then lastly, the sea turtle branch. I mentioned we have a new course for sea turtle responders, but we're also aiming to bring sea turtle expertise into the network. Traditionally, it's been more focused on seabirds because, as Vanessa mentioned, that's what's often been the most visible sign in a big oil spill of environmental impacts, but Europe includes the Mediterranean and sea turtles are also vulnerable. So we're aiming to bring in some of that expertise into our framework. So that was it from me. I hope it's been useful. Please take a look at our website for more information, and you can also follow us on Twitter as well to find out about our activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. That was a good presentation, and at least I came much more knowledge about Europa. I was wondering, you have a great overlook across to Europe. How would you describe the different levels of preparedness between different countries regarding oil wildlife response?
Yes, I think there is still a big variation. There are countries like Finland and the Netherlands and a few others where there have been many years of investment and many years of attention to wildlife preparedness. So you see quite well-established systems there. There are some other countries where things are in development, and there probably are a few countries where things are at a very early stage as well. So there's much to be done, but a lot has moved on in the last 10, 20 years in Europe as well. And the fact that the regional agreements have taken on wildlife response within their long-term objectives is also very supportive of that and will probably help more countries to move forward. And we try to promote this within Europa as well. So it's good news and bad news that there's still more to be done, but there has been a lot achieved as well. And there's some good examples out there of various countries that have models of preparedness that are more established.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite all the speakers who are still here to join our final discussion. Actually, one question came to my mind after Daniela's presentation, and the rate in the Bodybuild incident, the post-release survival rate was excellent. But do you know how well the animals survive the shock? They are first being oiled and then taken away and then handled by humans and again trafficked somewhere. So how well do the animals can survive this kind of shocks?
I think the Bodybuild scenario was a bit special because, as many responders from the incident said, swans are really tough to kill. I mean, they are really tough animals. So in that regard, during the Bodybuild incident, I think the swans did really well by surviving and carrying on, and the evidence of that is the release rate and also the survival rate after releasing. Other species might be different, and the survival rate during our rehab process might be quite different, and it will not likely be so high as we had in the Bodybuild incident. So the rates are quite lower compared to that. And also the monitoring afterwards, not all the incidents have been monitored quite thoroughly to see how the survival rate was after release, but I'm sure that the numbers will be lower than we had in Rotterdam. I don't know, I'm sure any of you might have more data on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I was also wondering about the interaction and communications between NGOs and authorities. Are you doing lobbying or trying to make your point more clear to the authorities and this way affect the funding for your projects? This question is for all.
Maybe I can jump in on that one, Mina and Lena. It's a good question, and I think it's a central theme of what we're doing with Europa at the moment. We're trying to encourage this authority NGO cooperation, and the workshops that we had recently with authorities, that was a big message there, and we continue to push that through the regional agreements as well. And we have contact with the NGOs in the countries where we have Euro representation, but also in some other countries as well. That's part of our work to know who are the responders in different countries. So wherever we can, we try to explain to authorities that, yes, this is work that NGOs can do, but you can't just expect them to take care of everything. You need to engage with them, to discuss preparedness with them as part of planning, to see what the expectations are on both sides and try to come to an agreement on how you can work together in an incident.
Yeah, thank you. And Neil, you have some questions?
Yes, I think for Saskia, for Europa anyway. The first one is perhaps an annoying question, but in your members, your map of your members, there was one country which was didn't seem to have any members, the UK. How does the UK participate, and how has things changed there, or is that problematic?
Not an annoying question at all. It's a good question. So the UK has been involved for many years in Euro work through the RSPCA. So they were involved in many of those spills. They were involved in the first Europa project, and prior work for that as well. But the RSPCA is not a full member of the network at the moment, but we do have a few technical experts, so people who've been in some of those spills and they have the technical background. They are part of some of our activities and they're part of technical committees. So they've contributed to writing of training courses, delivering training and some of the standards. So we have UK involvement, but not formal representation. We hope that the RSPCA will be able to join in the next few years. Okay, great. I have another question. See, I did well to avoid mentioning Brexit in the last question, so that was why I thought it might be annoying. My second question is actually about the training and the courses. It seems to me that it almost seems perfect for those sorts of things to fit in with within undergraduate degrees or master's degrees. Is there any kind of thinking there? Perhaps it could be embedded somewhere in some university. I think our university, the University of the Highlands and Islands, I could kind of see how it could fit really well there. Do you see it as very much standalone, or could it be integrated? No, I think that's a great idea. It's not something we've done so far, but there is a pilot project in the Netherlands to create a master's course, I believe, with the University of Utrecht, which is around, I think it's around veterinarians rather than wildlife response per se, but that's a bit of a first pilot, and it is a good idea. So that will give us a bit of experience, and then perhaps it can be expanded up. I don't know if anybody else has, Vanessa, if you have any comparable initiatives in Finland.
Yeah, that was why I actually raised my hand. I was just going to bring up that in Finland we've had in the past and looking to continue as well cooperation with the University of Helsinki and the veterinary students, because that is really a chance as well to get, you know, to incorporate certain elements or full course Europa course into the studies for those who are interested in wildlife veterinary science, for example, and then get them, you know, to go down the Europa path and become specialists and specialist veterinarians, for example.
Fantastic.
Great, thank you. I was wondering, the general public is hearing more and more about the biodiversity loss and mass extinctions. I think maybe not enough yet, but have you seen that the spotlight is turning to wildlife issues? Have you seen this in your work, that people would be more and more interested? Please.
Yeah, thank you. If no one else wants to go first, then yeah, I think there's a general, you know, awareness that is rising among the public of the climate and biodiversity crisis that we're in, and also realizing the importance of responding to events like these, because they can really have a large effect for a very long time on local and regional bird populations. So I do think that the general awareness has risen. Also amongst authorities, maybe it's because we've been pestering them for so many years, but just the fact that people are you know, more aware of environmental issues maybe than they were before. We also see that as an interest to join our training courses, for example, on both oil response and old wildlife response. So that's, I suppose, a positive thing.
Thank you. And Saskia, do you want to continue?
Yeah, it was just to add, I agree with Vanessa. I think there is more of an environmental awareness in the public now, but I think what we see is that the number of oil spills as a type of incident is going down, but there are still very many threats that marine wildlife populations are facing, which could lead to a mass stranding or a wreck. So the need for preparedness hasn't gone away. And I think that that's important to emphasize that as well, also with the public, that just because there's no oil spills, it doesn't mean that other things couldn't happen.
And Neil.
Yeah, I think with some of these pollution issues and some of these threats to species, when the public feel like there's something practical they can do, it's really you know, it gets them involved and gets them going. You know, in terms of plastics, for example, you know, people not using single-use plastics, but oil pollution, when you can actually volunteer and actually do something. I think some issues such as climate change are almost you know, people feel like, oh, what can I do? And of course, there's lots of things that an individual can do, but perhaps people don't see the direct connection. But so, unfortunately, when it's a bird being oiled or birds dying, those images and the fact that people can volunteer and can do something, I think that really allows people to get involved. Whereas different threats to wildlife are different. And yeah, if you like, climate change is such a big one, but people feel almost helpless sometimes, and that can be quite hard, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any other comments or questions to finalize the webinar? If not, then I think on behalf of the whole Popcorn cluster, I would like to thank you all for joining our webinar and sharing your expertise. And thank you also to the audience for joining us. We have recorded this webinar and we will share it on our website later on. And I hope you keep following the Popcorn, as we have many other activities coming up. So one more time, thank you, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for organizing it. See you.